Do you remember what life felt like in 1950s Canada? A time before smartphones, fast food, and 24-hour convenience, when communities, kitchens, and families shaped daily life in ways that felt both simple and extraordinary. From bustling grocery aisles to backyard hockey games, each day was filled with routines, resourcefulness, and small joys that left lasting memories. Let's step back together and explore 30 moments that capture what it was really like to live in Canada during this remarkable decade. Morning in the Maple City. Waking up in 1950s Canada. The sun peeked over rooftops dusted with the soft glow of morning, casting long shadows across quiet streets where bicycles leaned against picket fences, and the occasional dog barked in the distance. In the 1950s Canada, mornings weren't hurried affairs. There were no bleeps or buzzes from smartphones. Instead, families were stirred awake by the tinny charm of a wind-up alarm clock, the sizzle of bacon on a cast-iron skillet, or the gentle knock of a neighbor dropping by with news of the day. Windows rattled slightly in the crisp autumn air as curtains fluttered, revealing streets full of kids in woolen socks, heading to school with lunchboxes clutched tightly, each decorated with comic strip heroes or sports emblems that promise small escapes from the routine of the classroom. Inside the homes, kitchens radiated warmth. The smell of brewing coffee mingled with the scent of freshly baked bread, or porridge, sweetened with a drizzle of molasses. Mothers moved with practiced efficiency, flipping pancakes or stirring oatmeal while reminding children to button their coats and tie their shoes. Fathers, if already up, might be reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, the pages rustling under the weight of post-war headlines and local news. Every sound, from the clink of cutlery to the whir of an early electric toaster, was part of a daily symphony that marked life's rhythm before the rush of modern technology. The morning wasn't just a prelude to the day. It was a ritual, a quiet celebration of family, community, and the small pleasures of a slower pace. It was the aroma of comfort, the rhythm of ordinary life made extraordinary simply because it was lived together. In these simple beginnings, the Maple City awakened not just its streets, but the hearts of its people, setting the tone for the industrious, frugal, and hopeful day that lay ahead. Breakfast tables and brown sugar dreams. In 1950s Canada, breakfast was more than a meal. It was a daily gathering, a ritual that set the tone for the day. The kitchen table was the stage where families came together, sometimes in silence, sometimes in laughter, and often with the comforting scent of something warm rising from the stove. Bowls of oatmeal, thick and creamy, were sweetened with a generous sprinkling of brown sugar, the crystals melting into the steaming porridge, sending a caramel-scented invitation to start the day with contentment. For some households, cornmeal mush with a drizzle of molasses made its morning appearance, humble yet hearty, a nod to frugality and tradition. Children sat on wooden chairs, sometimes swinging their legs impatiently, waiting for the first bite, while parents sipped coffee or tea, their hands wrapped around mugs that radiated warmth. The clatter of spoons against bowls and the occasional pop of toast from the toaster punctuated the quiet hum of conversation. It was a slower pace, a time when there was room for stories about yesterday's adventures or plans for the day ahead. Sometimes a slice of bacon, fried to crisp perfection, would accompany eggs, and the aroma would fill the room, making even the groggiest family member sit up a little straighter. Brown sugar wasn't just an ingredient. It was a small indulgence that transformed ordinary grains into something sweet and comforting. It spoke of care, of the effort to make simple foods feel special, even when money was tight. In the 1950s, breakfast tables weren't just about feeding the body. They were about nourishing connections, creating small daily rituals that lingered in memory long after the last spoonful had been eaten. Every morning began not only with food, but with a sense of warmth, belonging, and the subtle joy of starting the day right. Cornmeal mush and molasses memories. There's a certain kind of nostalgia that rises from a simple bowl of cornmeal mush, the kind that carries you back to kitchens filled with warmth, chatter, and the faint scent of wood smoke from an early morning stove. In 1950s Canada, cornmeal mush was more than a breakfast. It was a testament to frugality and resilience. Cheap, shelf-stable, and filling, it fed families stretched thin by the lingering shadows of post-war recovery.
My mother grew up during the Great Depression and ate oatmeal for breakfast almost every day.
A drizzle of molasses, dark and sticky, transformed the plain yellow grains into a sweet, comforting ritual, the taste lingering on the tongue like a whispered memory of simpler times. The preparation was straightforward, a small alchemy of water, salt, and cornmeal, stirred carefully over a low flame until it thickened into a creamy golden consistency. Mothers and grandmothers would stir patiently, keeping one eye on the rising sun and another on the clock, making sure it was ready in time for the children to eat before school. Sometimes the mush was sliced and fried the next day, turning leftovers into crispy, caramelized bites. A humble ingenuity that reflected a culture of making the most out of what was on hand. Eating cornmeal mush wasn't just about nourishment, it was about togetherness. Families huddled around the table, spoons clinking against bowls, sharing small talk, laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of a warm morning meal. In a world without instant breakfasts or sugary cereals marketed to children, cornmeal mush and molasses offered a grounding ritual, one that tied the family to the rhythm of home and season. Today, it may seem quaint, even odd, compared to the latte and avocado toast culture of modern mornings, but those who remember it speak fondly of its comfort, its heartiness, and the slow, deliberate start to a day that reminded them that life, even in its simplest forms, could be sweet. Cornmeal mush is memory on a plate, a humble dish, rich in both flavor and nostalgia. Eggs, bacon, and Saturday treats. Saturday mornings in the 1950s, Canada had a rhythm all their own. The week's work was winding down, school chores were momentarily forgotten, and the kitchen became a stage for a small, delicious rebellion against the weekday routine. Eggs and bacon were the centerpiece, sizzling in a cast-iron skillet, the aroma weaving through the house and drawing everyone to the table. Unlike the hurried breakfasts of weekdays, oatmeal, toast, maybe a cup of tea, Saturdays were a chance to linger, to indulge in a little culinary showmanship before the day's errands began. Eggs were fried or scrambled, sometimes baked into a simple omelet with leftover vegetables or cheese, their golden hue promising richness and warmth. Bacon crackled in the pan, its fat curling and hissing, a sound that was as comforting as it was tantalizing. The combination was simple, unpretentious, but elevated by the care put into preparation and the joy of eating together. Children often got an extra slice of toast or a drizzle of syrup, and the slow pace of the morning allowed everyone to savor both the flavors and the company. Beyond the meal itself, Saturday breakfasts carried a sense of celebration. They were small treats, a reward for enduring the week's routines, and an opportunity to teach children the rhythm of home life, the careful stirring of eggs, the timing of crisping bacon, the patience needed for everything to come together. In many homes, the smell of coffee filled the air, mingling with the sugar from a pancake or waffle treat, creating an olfactory map of comfort and belonging. Looking back, it's easy to romanticize these mornings, but there was truth in that nostalgia. Eggs, bacon, and Saturday treats weren't extravagant. They were ordinary foods made extraordinary by ritual, patience, and togetherness. They remind us that sometimes the simplest meals are the ones that linger in memory the longest. School lunchboxes and PB&J rituals. In 1950s Canada, the school day was bookended by a ritual as reliable as the morning bell, the opening of the lunchbox. For many children, brown paper bags or metal tins held the promise of simple, familiar comfort. A peanut butter and jelly sandwich, sometimes accompanied by a crisp apple or a handful of cookies, and maybe a thermos of warm milk or juice. The peanut butter and jelly sandwich wasn't just a quick bite. It was a symbol of routine, a small anchor in the structured cadence of school life. Mothers, often the architects of these portable meals, took care to spread the peanut butter evenly, sometimes adding a layer of honey or a pinch of cinnamon for a special touch. The jelly, usually strawberry or grape, peeked out from the edges like a sweet surprise, and the soft sandwich bread was pressed just so, easy for little hands to grasp. Every lunchbox told a story of home, of attention and care, and occasionally of indulgence when a slice of homemade cake or a few chocolate squares slipped in as a treat. At recess, these sandwiches were unwrapped with a sense of ritual. Children would sit together, trading bites, comparing jelly swirls, and sometimes hoarding the small surprises tucked in by attentive parents. It was more than nutrition. It was community, camaraderie, and a chance to savor a moment away from lessons and homework. Looking back, the simplicity of these lunches stands in stark contrast to today's pre-packaged, Instagram-ready school meals. Yet there was something enduring about the peanut butter and jelly ritual. It was practical, frugal, and comforting, an edible reminder of home in the middle of a busy day. In every sticky bite and sweet smear of jelly, there was warmth, care, and the quiet magic of childhood memories carefully packed into a lunchbox. Grilled cheese and tomato soup. Comfort. There are few meals as timeless, or as universally comforting, as a grilled cheese sandwich paired with a steaming bowl of tomato soup. In 1950s Canada, this duo wasn't just a quick lunch. It was a hug on a plate, a moment of warmth in kitchens filled with the aromas of frying bread and simmering tomatoes. The preparation was simple, almost ritualistic. Slices of white bread buttered generously, stacked with melting cheddar, and pressed into golden, crispy perfection on a hot skillet. Meanwhile, a pot of tomato soup bubbled gently on the stove, sometimes from scratch, sometimes from a tin, but always served with care. Children would press their noses against the counter, watching the cheese stretch as the sandwiches were cut diagonally, the steam curling upward like an invitation. Parents moved between stove and table, ladling soup into bowls, occasionally sprinkling a pinch of sugar or a swirl of cream to soften the tang. The clatter of cutlery and the hum of conversation filled the room, turning an ordinary weekday or rainy afternoon into a shared sensory experience. The beauty of grilled cheese and tomato soup wasn't just in its flavor, it was in its accessibility. Bread, cheese, and tomatoes were affordable and shelf-stable, making it a reliable option for families of all means. It was practical yet indulgent, nourishing yet joyful, a small triumph of simplicity. Even today, when convenience often trumps tradition, the combination still evokes nostalgia. Bite into the crisp exterior of a grilled cheese, dip it into warm, tangy tomato soup, and you're tasting the echoes of post-war kitchens, the lessons of frugality, and the quiet magic of shared meals. In 1950s Canada, this pairing wasn't just food, it was comfort, community, and the subtle art of making ordinary ingredients extraordinary. Fish cakes and leftover magic. In the 1950s, Canadian kitchens were often arenas of ingenuity, where leftovers weren't a nuisance, but a challenge to be turned into something delicious. Fish cakes epitomize this resourcefulness. A humble dish that transformed yesterday's boiled or baked fish into golden, crisp patties, stretching meals further while satisfying hungry families. The process was simple yet creative. Flaked fish mixed with mashed potatoes, onions, a pinch of salt and pepper, sometimes a hint of parsley, then shaped into patties and fried to a light, crunchy perfection. The aroma of sizzling fish cakes filled the kitchen, a mix of warmth, salt, and anticipation. Children hovered near the stove, impatient for the first crispy bites, while parents skillfully flipped patties with a spatula, keeping the kitchen lively yet orderly. Every portion was a testament to careful planning and frugality. Nothing went to waste. Every flavor was amplified, and the dish carried a quiet satisfaction that only resourcefulness can bring. Fish cakes were more than a practical solution. They were part of the rhythm of family life. Served with a simple side of boiled vegetables, a dollop of ketchup, or a smear of buttered bread, they became a shared experience around the table, inviting conversation, laughter, and a sense of pride in turning modest ingredients into something everyone enjoyed. Looking back, there's a charm in the simplicity and inventiveness of fish cakes. In today's world of pre-packaged meals and takeout, it's easy to forget the pleasure of creating something hearty from what was on hand. In 1950s Canada, every fish cake carried with it the warmth of home, the ingenuity of homemakers, and the quiet joy of turning leftovers into magic. a culinary lesson in thrift, care, and the satisfaction of a meal well made. Meatloaf nights and mashed potato mountains. In 1950s Canadian homes, meatloaf was more than dinner. It was a ritual, a centerpiece of family life that blended practicality with comfort. Ground beef, often stretched with breadcrumbs or oats, was mixed with onions, a touch of seasoning, and sometimes a dash of ketchup or Worcestershire sauce, then molded into a loaf and baked until golden brown. The aroma that filled the house as it roasted was unmistakable, a warm, savory scent that seemed to wrap the kitchen in familiarity and promise. Mashed potatoes accompanied the meatloaf in generous, billowy mounds, whipped with butter and milk until creamy and smooth, sometimes sprinkled with a dash of black pepper or a few drips of gravy from the meat. The combination was simple but satisfying, a pairing that could feed a growing family on a modest budget while still feeling indulgent. Children, elbows on the table, would eagerly scoop mountains of potatoes onto their plates, topping them with gravy that glistened like molten gold. These meals were as much about connection as they were about sustenance. Families gathered around the table, sharing stories of the day, debating neighborhood gossip, and laughing over small mishaps, all while savoring a dinner that was hearty, familiar, and crafted with care. Meatloaf nights were predictable, but predictability was part of the comfort. A dependable anchor in the week's rhythm, a taste of home that reinforced family bonds. In retrospect, the charm of meatloaf and mashed potatoes lies in its simplicity and adaptability. Modern diners may reach for convenience foods or pre-made meal kits, but there's something timeless about a home-cooked loaf of meat paired with creamy potatoes. A reminder that good food doesn't have to be fancy to be memorable, and that the heart of a meal is often measured not in ingredients, but in the warmth of shared moments around the table. Cabbage rolls and immigrant kitchens. Cabbage rolls were more than a dish in the 1950s Canada. They were a story on a plate, a culinary bridge between old world traditions and new beginnings. Immigrant families, arriving from Eastern Europe and beyond, brought with them recipes passed down through generations, adapting them to the ingredients they could find in local markets. Large cabbage leaves were blanched until tender, then filled with a mixture of ground meat, rice, onions, and seasonings, carefully rolled and simmered in a rich tomato sauce that bubbled slowly on the stove. Each step was deliberate, a labor of love that honored both heritage and the hard work of homemakers. The preparation of cabbage rolls was often a communal affair. Children might help separate the leaves or watch the rolls being tucked into the pot, learning not only a recipe, but also the rhythm of family life and the value of shared labor. Kitchens smelled of simmering tomatoes, earthy cabbage, and spices, filling homes with a warmth that transcended the ingredients. The process was long, but the reward was a dish that could feed a family for days, a tangible example of frugality meeting flavor. Cabbage rolls symbolized more than nourishment. They were a testament to resilience and adaptation, how immigrant families maintained cultural identity while embracing life in a new country. Served at family tables, often alongside potatoes or rye bread, they brought a sense of continuity and connection to roots that could otherwise feel distant in post-war Canada. Today, cabbage rolls may seem quaint or labor-intensive, yet they endure in memory for their heartiness, flavor, and the love infused into every roll. They remind us that food is never just food. It carries history, heritage, and the stories of hands that worked long hours to create something both practical and comforting. In 1950s immigrant kitchens, cabbage rolls were an edible embrace, a reminder that even in a new world, home could be recreated one carefully rolled leaf at a time. Shepherd's pie, frugal, filling, and fun. Shepherd's pie was the unsung hero of 1950s Canadian kitchens, a dish that married frugality with comfort in the most satisfying way. Ground meat, often beef or lamb, was browned with onions and sometimes mixed with whatever vegetables were on hand: carrots, peas, or leftover root vegetables from the week. This savory mixture was then topped with a generous layer of mashed potatoes, spread and fluffed into peaks that would brown in the oven, forming a golden crust that promised warmth and fullness with every bite. The beauty of shepherd's pie was in its resourcefulness. It stretched small portions of meat to feed hungry families, repurposed leftovers, and transformed modest ingredients into a meal that felt indulgent. Children often helped mash the potatoes or sprinkle a little extra butter on top, turning preparation into a playful kitchen ritual. The oven's heat, combined with the savory aroma of meat, onions, and potato, made kitchens feel like the heart of the home, alive, bustling, and fragrant. Eating shepherd's pie was comfort incarnate. The creamy, buttery potato contrasted with the rich, savory filling beneath, and every bite felt like a small reward for the care taken in its making. Families would gather around the table, spoons in hand, savoring both the flavors and the shared experience. In a time when convenience foods were rare and frugality was a necessity, dishes like shepherd's pie provided sustenance, warmth, and a sense of satisfaction that went beyond mere hunger. Even today, shepherd's pie evokes nostalgia for home-cooked meals where every ingredient had purpose and every bite carried love. In 1950s Canada, it wasn't just dinner, it was a lesson in ingenuity, a celebration of the simple pleasures of family life, and proof that hearty, humble food could leave a lasting impression long after the last forkful had disappeared. Turkey stews and root vegetable tales. In 1950s Canada, turkey wasn't reserved solely for holidays. Leftover turkey from Sunday dinners often found new life in a hearty stew, simmered slowly with root vegetables that were abundant, affordable, and seasonally available. Carrots, turnips, parsnips, and potatoes joined the pot alongside onions and a touch of herbs, creating a medley of flavors that was humble but deeply satisfying. The kitchen would fill with the gentle aroma of simmering broth, a promise of warmth on chilly autumn or winter evenings. Making turkey stew was an exercise in practicality and creativity. Leftover meat was shredded and added to the pot, stretching portions further while preserving every bit of flavor. Sometimes, a can of tomato or a splash of gravy enriched the broth, ensuring that even the simplest stew felt substantial. The process was straightforward but meditative. Stir occasionally, taste for seasoning, and allow the ingredients to meld into a comforting whole. For children, the sight of bubbling stew, and the anticipation of tender meat and soft vegetables was a small daily delight, a reminder that leftovers could be just as exciting as freshly prepared meals. Beyond sustenance, turkey stew carried emotional weight. It spoke of thrift and ingenuity, of families making the most of what they had while still sharing a nourishing, hearty meal. Around the table, stories were exchanged, laughter echoed, and the day's worries melted into the warmth of home. Root vegetables, often overlooked in modern kitchens, became heroes, their earthy flavors grounding the dish and connecting families to the rhythms of the seasons. Looking back, turkey stews and root vegetable tales are emblematic of 1950s Canadian home cooking. Practical, resourceful, and deeply comforting. They remind us that even modest ingredients, handled with care, can create meals that are rich not just in flavor, but in memory, tradition, and the quiet joy of shared family life. Mac and cheese before the box. Long before the convenience of neon orange powdered packets, mac and cheese in 1950s Canada was a labor of love, a dish that combined frugality with comfort in its purest form. Families made it from scratch, boiling elbow macaroni until tender and melting real cheese into a simple bechamel sauce, sometimes enriched with a knob of butter or a splash of milk. The result was creamy, cheesy, and utterly satisfying. A far cry from the instant meals of later decades, yet somehow more indulgent and heartfelt. The beauty of scratch mac and cheese lay in its versatility. Leftover bits of cheese could be shredded and folded in, and a sprinkling of breadcrumbs on top added a satisfying crunch after baking. Some households incorporated small additions, a dash of mustard, a pinch of paprika, or even diced tomatoes to brighten the dish. Every spoonful was comforting, familiar, and filling, perfect for feeding a family without breaking the budget. Mac and cheese also carried a certain magic for children. The rich, gooey cheese made it feel like a treat, while the soft pasta was easy to eat, forgiving, and endlessly satisfying. Parents, meanwhile, appreciated how the dish could stretch leftovers, be prepared in advance, or stand alone as a complete meal with a side of vegetables. It was both practical and indulgent, a hallmark of 1950s ingenuity in the kitchen. Even today, the nostalgia of homemade mac and cheese endures. It evokes childhood kitchens where simplicity met creativity, where basic ingredients became more than sustenance. They became comfort, connection, and tradition. Before the box, mac and cheese wasn't just a meal. It was a quiet celebration of care, warmth, and the enduring power of a humble, cheesy dish to bring a family together. Apple pies and lattice top love. There was something undeniably magical about an apple pie in a 1950s Canadian kitchen. The scent alone, sweet, spiced, and warm, could draw the whole family into the kitchen before the first slice had even cooled. Crisp apples, often local or from backyard orchards, were peeled, sliced, and tossed with sugar, cinnamon, and a pinch of nutmeg, creating a fragrant filling that promised comfort with every bite. But the real showstopper was the crust. Buttery, flaky, and lovingly woven into a delicate lattice that allowed the filling to peek through, golden and inviting beneath its patterned top. Baking an apple pie was more than following a recipe. It was a ritual, a way to mark time and celebrate both abundance and care. Mothers and grandmothers rolled dough with practiced hands, teaching children to press edges and create patterns, sharing wisdom through flour-dusted fingers and whispered instructions. The oven's gentle heat transformed simple ingredients into something greater than the sum of its parts. A tactile, olfactory, and emotional experience all at once. Apple pie held a dual role in 1950s homes. It was a dessert, yes, but also a symbol of home, hospitality, and family pride. Served at Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, or even an ordinary Thursday, it connected generations, evoking stories of orchards, harvests, and afternoons spent peeling apples in the soft light of the kitchen. Today, the lattice-top apple pie still carries that nostalgic pull, even as store-bought versions dominate shelves. In the 1950s, it wasn't just food, it was ritual, artistry, and love baked into every layer. Each forkful was a reminder that home cooking could transform ordinary ingredients into memories that lingered long after the last crumb disappeared. Apple pies were more than desserts. They were edible expressions of care, creativity, and the quiet joy of family life. Brownies, ginger cookies, and sweet nostalgia. Desserts in 1950s. Canadian homes weren't just about sugar. They were about tradition, comfort, and the quiet joy of sharing something homemade. Brownies, with their fudgy centers and slightly crisp edges, were a staple, often baked after school to greet children with warmth and sweetness. A simple mix of butter, sugar, eggs, cocoa, and flour could transform a modest pantry into a source of delight. The chocolate aroma curling through kitchens like a familiar hug. Each square carried more than flavor. It carried the promise of care, the satisfaction of creating something by hand, and the excitement of a treat earned or shared. Ginger cookies added another layer to the culinary memory of the era. Spiced with ginger, cinnamon, and molasses, these chewy, fragrant cookies were perfect for tea time or an afternoon snack. Rolling the dough, cutting shapes, and baking them filled kitchens with scents that seemed to linger long after the oven had cooled. Children might sneak a piece straight from the sheet, smudging their fingers with sticky sweetness, while parents kept a watchful yet indulgent eye. The act of baking itself, measuring, mixing, and waiting, became a ritual, a rhythm of home life that reinforced connection and patience. Both brownies and ginger cookies were more than desserts. They were markers of memory. They represented frugality with a flourish, simple ingredients transformed into moments of joy, and the artistry of making ordinary foods feel special. In a world without pre-packaged treats on every corner, these sweets were treasures, evoking laughter, conversation, and a sense of belonging around the table. Even today, the smell of brownies baking or the bite of a ginger cookie can transport someone back decades, reminding them that in 1950s Canada, the sweetest moments were often the simplest, handmade, heartfelt, and full of nostalgia. Sweetness was never just in the sugar. It was in the memory of family, warmth, and care. Rice pudding and tapioca memories. In the 1950s Canada, desserts didn't need to be elaborate to leave a lasting impression. Rice pudding and tapioca were humble stars of the kitchen, transforming simple pantry staples into creamy, comforting treats that nourished both body and soul. Rice, slowly cooked with milk and sugar until thick and luscious, became a canvas for flavor, often enriched with a touch of vanilla, a sprinkle of cinnamon, or a handful of raisins. Tapioca, with its tiny pearls swelling into a delicate custard, offered a different texture and a quiet elegance that delighted children and adults alike. These puddings were more than sweet endings. They were lessons in patience and care. The stove required attention, gentle stirring to prevent sticking, tasting for just the right balance of sweetness, and timing so that each pudding reached the perfect consistency. In many households, making these desserts was also a teaching moment, as mothers and grandmothers guided children through the process, handing down the knowledge and traditions that shaped family kitchens for generations. Eating rice pudding or tapioca was a small, comforting ritual. Bowls were served warm, sometimes chilled, and often sprinkled with cinnamon or nutmeg. Families gathered around the table, savoring each bite, sharing conversation, and delighting in the simple pleasure of a homemade treat. These desserts spoke of frugality, of making the most of what was on hand, and of finding richness in simplicity. Today, they may seem quaint or old-fashioned, but rice pudding and tapioca hold a special place in memory. They remind us that in the 1950s, dessert was about more than flavor. It was about warmth, care, and connection. Each creamy spoonful carried stories of kitchens filled with love, the quiet artistry of homemakers, and the enduring comfort of traditions that have sweetened lives for decades. Thanksgiving tables across Canada. In 1950s Canada, Thanksgiving was more than a long weekend. It was a cherished opportunity for families to gather, reflect, and share a feast that celebrated both the season and togetherness. The dining table became the centerpiece of the home, often adorned with a modest autumnal display, a crisp tablecloth, hand-picked leaves, and occasionally a small pumpkin or two to mark the harvest. Each household had its own traditions, but certain staples were nearly universal, embodying warmth, abundance, and care. The turkey was, of course, the star of the table, roasted to golden perfection, often stuffed with a simple bread and herb mixture. It provided enough meat to feed a crowd while leaving leftovers for creative reinventions in the days that followed. Root vegetables like carrots, parsnips, and potatoes were roasted or mashed, their earthy flavors balancing the richness of the bird. Cranberry sauce, sometimes homemade, sometimes from a can, added a bright, tangy note, while fresh-baked bread and buttery rolls rounded out the meal. Desserts were equally important. Apple pies, pumpkin tarts, or date squares offered a sweet conclusion, each slice infused with tradition and the flavors of the season. Preparation was a family affair, with children setting the table, polishing silverware, or stirring custards under watchful eyes. The act of cooking and sharing the meal reinforced connections, passing on culinary knowledge and the value of communal effort. Thanksgiving in the 1950s wasn't about extravagance. It was about intention, gratitude, and presence. Meals were hearty, flavors familiar, and the ritual of gathering emphasized relationships over convenience. Looking back, these tables hold more than food. They hold memory, culture, and the gentle reminder that celebrations are best measured in love, laughter, and the small, deliberate pleasures of a home-cooked meal shared with those who matter most. Christmas baking, cookies and candy galore. Christmas. In 1950s, Canada was a season defined by scent, sweetness, and the quiet magic of home kitchens coming alive. The weeks leading up to the holiday were filled with the rhythmic hum of mixers, the clatter of rolling pins, and the gentle laughter of families working side by side. Cookies and candies weren't just treats, they were traditions, tangible expressions of care, and a way to celebrate togetherness in the simplest, most delicious forms. Gingerbread men, sugar cookies, and shortbreads lined baking sheets, their dough carefully cut into shapes, sometimes decorated with colorful icing or sprinkles. Candies, peppermint bark, fudge, and homemade caramels were wrapped in waxed paper and set aside for gifting, or shared eagerly with visiting neighbors. The kitchen became a workshop of creativity and joy, where children learned to measure, mix, and decorate, their faces dusted with flour and their hands sticky with sugar. Every treat carried not only flavor, but also lessons in patience, care, and pride in a job well done. The magic of Christmas baking was as much about the process as the outcome. Home smelled of cinnamon, nutmeg, and vanilla. Laughter mingled with the hum of ovens, and small hands eagerly stole a taste here and there, their delight echoing the warmth of the season. Plates of cookies were arranged carefully for Santa, while bowls of fudge and candies were shared among family and friends, reinforcing bonds and creating memories that lingered long after the last bite. Looking back, the cookies and candies of 1950s Christmases symbolize more than sweetness. They represent community, tradition, and the simple joy of making something with love. In a world before pre-packaged convenience, the act of baking became a celebration, a bridge between generations, and a way to turn ordinary ingredients into extraordinary memories that continue to inspire nostalgia today. Easter bread and homemade preserves. Easter in the 1950s, Canada brought with it a sense of renewal, family togetherness, and kitchens filled with the warm, yeasty aroma of bread baking. Easter bread, often braided and sometimes studded with raisins or flavored with citrus zest, was more than a seasonal treat. It was a symbol of care, tradition, and the subtle artistry of home cooking. Families would gather around counters dusted with flour, shaping dough into plats, brushing the tops with egg wash for a golden shine, and sharing stories as it rose slowly in anticipation of the holiday table. Alongside the bread, homemade preserves played a starring role. Jars of strawberry, raspberry, or plum jam lined pantry shelves, their deep hues catching the light and hinting at the sweetness within. Preparing preserves was a labor of love. Fruit was carefully washed, simmered with sugar, and bottled while still hot to ensure both safety and flavor. The act of preserving connected families to the seasons, to the harvest, and to the practical wisdom of stretching nature's bounty to last through colder months. Children often helped with stirring or labeling, learning the rhythms of patience and precision, while contributing to a treasured family tradition. Easter bread and preserves weren't just food. They were markers of celebration, memory, and ingenuity. Served together, the soft, fragrant bread spread with sweet, tangy jam was a breakfast or dessert that carried the flavors of home, heritage, and careful labor. They reminded families of what mattered: shared effort, connection, and the simple joys of making something from scratch. Even today, the sight of braided bread or a jar of homemade preserves evokes nostalgia for kitchens filled with warmth, laughter, and the quiet, enduring magic of Easter traditions. In 1950s Canada, these humble yet beautiful foods were more than culinary creations. They were edible expressions of care, family, and seasonal celebration. Grocery aisles, Dominion, Loblaws, and small shops. Walking down a grocery aisle in 1950s Canada was a very different experience from the bright, self-checkout filled supermarkets of today. Stores like Dominion and Loblaws were central to community life. Their shelves stocked with a mix of staples, imported goods, and local finds, while small neighborhood shops offered a personal touch and familiar faces. The aisles were narrower, the displays simpler, but the experience was richer in human connection. Shopkeepers remembered your name, your preferences, and sometimes even your family's favorite brands, making shopping as much a social ritual as a practical errand. Canned goods, jars of preserves, and boxes of staples lined shelves in neat rows, each item a promise of meals to come. Housewives and young mothers navigated their trolleys or baskets with care, comparing prices and planning meals that balance frugality with flavor. There was a sense of resourcefulness baked into every choice. A tin of beans could stretch a stew, a bag of flour could turn into bread or cookies, and a slab of cheese might appear in multiple dishes throughout the week. Small shops offered the kind of intimacy larger stores could not, with counters stacked high with fresh bread, cured meats, and local produce, often cut to order and wrapped in paper with a smile. These grocery aisles were more than commerce. They were part of the rhythm of daily life. Families learned about seasons, pricing, and quality. Children tagged along, wide-eyed at the colorful packaging and the occasional treat, absorbing lessons in budgeting and patience. Looking back, the aisles of Dominion, Loblaws, and small shops capture a unique moment in Canadian life, a blend of practicality, community, and the simple pleasure of selecting ingredients that would become home-cooked meals shared around the table. In the 1950s, Canada, shopping for groceries was an experience as nourishing for the soul as it was for the belly. Victory gardens and canning adventures. In 1950s Canada, the backyard was more than a patch of grass. It was a place of purpose, creativity, and seasonal labor. Victory gardens, born out of wartime necessity, had become a post-war tradition for many families seeking fresh, affordable produce. Tomatoes, beans, carrots, and cucumbers thrived in neat rows, their vibrant colors contrasting with the earth, and each plant promised not just food, but the satisfaction of growing something with your own hands. Children often helped water, weed, or pick ripe vegetables, learning early the rhythms of nature and the value of patience and care. Harvest time brought its own excitement, baskets overflowing with produce, hands sticky with tomato juice or the tang of cucumbers, and the lively chatter of families preparing for the next step. Canning. Canning was an adventure in both science and art. Glass jars were washed and sterilized, lids fitted carefully, and simmering pots of vegetables, jams, and preserves were poured in while still hot, sealing in flavor and extending the bounty far beyond the growing season. Every sealed jar on the pantry shelf represented planning, frugality, and the joy of transforming fresh harvest into food that would last through the long Canadian winters. Victory gardens and canning adventures were also a cultural touchstone. They connected families to the land, to the seasons, and to the resourcefulness of their parents or grandparents. They were exercises in self-reliance, teaching lessons in conservation, creativity, and the satisfaction of tangible results. The smells of simmering tomatoes, sweet berries, and pickling spices filled homes, weaving a sensory memory that lingered long after the jars were stored. Looking back, these gardens and canning projects were more than chores. They were rituals of care, community, and resilience. In 1950s Canada, growing, harvesting, and preserving your own food wasn't just practical. It was a joyful, hands-on way of celebrating life, family, and the quiet magic of turning simple ingredients into enduring sustenance. Household hacks, chores, laundry, and sewing. Life in 1950s Canada revolved around routines that demanded skill, patience, and a touch of ingenuity. Kitchens and laundry rooms were bustling hubs of activity, where homemakers mastered the art of multitasking long before it became a buzzword. Chores weren't simply tasks to check off a list. They were exercises in efficiency and creativity. Soap flakes, wringers, and washboards turned laundry into a full-body workout, yet the process carried satisfaction. The smell of freshly washed clothes, the crispness of linens hung on the line, and the pride in garments pressed and folded just so. Sewing, too, was both practical and artistic. Torn socks, worn dresses, or a child's growing trousers could be patched, hemmed, or entirely recreated with needle, thread, and a keen eye. Patterns were followed or adapted, bringing new life to fabrics and teaching children the value of resourcefulness. Even mending became a subtle lesson in creativity, patience, and the pride of making something last. Household hacks extended beyond laundry and sewing. Clever uses of leftover food, repurposing jars, or using everyday items for cleaning and organization were all part of a domestic toolkit honed over time. Homemakers shared these tips like secret recipes, passed along between neighbors, through community bulletins, or from mother to daughter. Every small innovation reinforced resilience, practicality, and a culture of making do without sacrificing care or comfort. Looking back, these routines offer more than nostalgia. They reveal the intelligence, discipline, and creativity that defined home life in the 1950s. Chores, laundry, and sewing were not merely labor. They were acts of love, teaching lessons in frugality, skill, and resourcefulness. In every folded sheet, every patched garment, and every scrubbed floor was a story of family, community, and the quiet mastery of turning daily work into enduring satisfaction. Neighborhood life and front porch stories. In 1950s Canada, neighborhoods were more than clusters of houses. They were vibrant communities where life unfolded on front porches, sidewalks, and quiet streets. Children played hopscotch, marbles, and street hockey under the watchful eyes of neighbors, their laughter mingling with the hum of daily chores and the occasional bark of a dog. Front porches became stages for storytelling, gossip, and camaraderie, where adults shared advice, recipes, and news, while watching the world pass by at a slower, more deliberate pace. Evenings were particularly rich with these small rituals. As the sun dipped low, families gathered on porches, rocking chairs creaking gently, sharing tales of the day, teasing neighbors, or offering homemade treats to children returning from play. The front step was a threshold between private life and the wider community, a place where bonds were strengthened and a sense of belonging was nurtured. Visits were often impromptu, dropping by with a pie, borrowing sugar, or simply stopping to chat about the weather, school, or local events. This communal rhythm shaped the culture of the time. Families relied on one another not just for company, but for practical support, advice, and shared labor. Children learned manners, cooperation, and storytelling. By example, while adults exchanged wisdom about everything from household hacks to parenting and frugality. In many ways, the front porch was a classroom, a social hub, and a stage for the art of neighborliness. Looking back, neighborhood life in the 1950s evokes a sense of intimacy and connection, often absent in modern suburban sprawl. Front porch stories weren't just conversation, they were a way of weaving community into daily life, reminding families that home extended beyond four walls. In this era, belonging, friendship, and shared experiences were as essential to Canadian life as the meals cooked in the kitchen or the chores completed inside. Street hockey, skating, and backyard fun. In 1950s Canada, childhood was inseparable from outdoor play. Streets, frozen ponds, and backyards transformed into arenas of imagination, athleticism, and community. Street hockey was a rite of passage. Sticks carved from scrap wood, a ball or puck improvised, and children of all ages claiming driveways, sidewalks, and alleys as their rink. Games were spirited and unstructured, full of laughter, scraped knees, and the kind of camaraderie that only comes from shared effort and friendly competition. Parents might peek from windows or sit on their porches, cheering lightly while keeping an eye on the action, ensuring safety without dampening the freedom of play. When winter arrived, frozen ponds and backyard rinks became magical spaces for skating. Children glided across ice under pale sunlight or the soft glow of street lamps, blades carving tracks that would vanish by morning. Sleds, snow forts, and snowball battles turned yards into playgrounds of endless creativity, and the chill of the season was no match for the warmth of friendship and laughter. Families often joined in, turning simple activities into shared memories that bonded generations. Backyard fun wasn't just limited to sports. Hide and seek, hopscotch, or inventive games using whatever materials were at hand, reflected the ingenuity of the era. These moments fostered independence, teamwork, and resilience, teaching children how to create joy from simplicity. The outdoors became both a classroom and a sanctuary, offering lessons in resourcefulness, problem-solving, and the joy of movement. Looking back, the childhoods of 1950s Canada were defined by active, imaginative play. Street hockey, skating, and backyard adventures weren't just pastimes. They were formative experiences, blending physical skill, social connection, and the freedom to explore. In those games, scraped knees and chilly fingers were badges of memory, and the laughter that echoed across streets and yards remains a timeless soundtrack of Canadian youth. Radio, early TV, and cinematic escapes. In 1950s Canada, the living room was a portal to worlds far beyond the neighborhood, thanks to the crackle of radios, the flicker of early television sets, and the magic of cinema. Families gathered around radios in the evenings, tuning in to dramatic serials, comedy programs, or the latest news bulletins. The medium demanded imagination. Listeners pictured characters, settings, and adventures in their minds, creating a shared experience that was both intimate and communal. Television was still a novelty in many homes, its small black and white screen offering glimpses of variety shows, local programming, and early broadcasts of national events. For children, TV was spellbinding. Cartoon adventures, puppet shows, and family-friendly series became appointments in the daily routine, moments to bond over stories that were at once entertaining and formative. Parents watched alongside, balancing amusement with practical oversight, and the medium quickly became a fixture of household life. Cinemas provided a different kind of escape. A trip to the local movie theater was an event, complete with tickets purchased at the counter, the scent of buttered popcorn, and the thrill of sitting in the dark as stories unfolded on the big screen. Whether it was a western, a drama, or a musical, films offered a window into faraway worlds and imaginative possibilities. A collective experience shared with neighbors and friends. These forms of entertainment shaped the rhythm of Canadian life. They were communal yet personal, inexpensive yet transformative, offering respite, excitement, and connection. Radio, early television, and cinema weren't just distractions. They were cultural touchstones, sparking conversation, inspiring creativity, and giving families and communities stories to share long after the final note or closing credits. In the 1950s, they brought the wider world into homes, blending imagination, wonder, and togetherness in ways that remain nostalgic even today. Work, school, and the daily Canadian grind. Life in 1950s. Canada was defined by routine, rhythm, and a quietly resilient approach to daily responsibilities. The workday often began early, with parents heading to factories, offices, or farms, each job carrying its own demands and patterns. Men in suits or overalls, women balancing paid labor with household chores, and teenagers taking on part-time work all contributed to a culture of diligence and practical problem-solving. Work was rarely glamorous, but it was steady. and it framed the structure of family life. Morning routines, meal planning, and evenings around the dinner table revolved around the demands of the day. School, too, was a structured affair. Children walked to local schools, sometimes in neat uniforms, sometimes bundled against Canadian winters, carrying brown paper lunch bags and satchels filled with books and pencils. Lessons were traditional, focusing on reading, writing, arithmetic, and the social etiquette deemed essential for young Canadians. Recess, sports, and after-school activities offered small escapes, yet even play was disciplined, reflecting societal expectations and a broader understanding that effort and perseverance were values to be instilled early. The grind of daily life was balanced with community and ritual. Evenings were marked by homework, dinner, or quiet conversation, while weekends brought the chance for chores, errands, and social visits. Despite the predictability, there was a rhythm that brought stability, continuity, and a sense of purpose. Children observed the routines of their elders, learning lessons in responsibility, resourcefulness, and pride in honest work. Looking back, the daily Canadian grind of the 1950s was both structured and formative. It shaped character, family bonds, and community cohesion, embedding values of diligence, respect, and perseverance. In its steady repetition, it provided a framework for life, grounding families in routines that were practical, dependable, and quietly meaningful. A foundation for both personal growth and collective memory. Economic hardship and clever resourcefulness. For many Canadian families in the 1950s, life required a careful balancing act between need and ingenuity. While post-war prosperity was on the horizon for some, others still navigated the lingering shadows of economic hardship. Households learned to stretch every dollar, transform modest ingredients into filling meals, and turn everyday items into tools of efficiency. Frugality wasn't merely a virtue. It was a necessity, and resourcefulness became a defining feature of daily life. In the kitchen, this meant creativity with leftovers, inventive substitutions, and making the most of seasonal produce. Stale bread became breadcrumbs for meatloaf. Leftover vegetables transformed into soups or stews, and inexpensive staples like rice, potatoes, and beans were elevated through careful seasoning and thoughtful preparation. Clothing was mended or repurposed, fabric scraps became quilts, and small hacks in laundry, cleaning, and household maintenance reflected a culture of clever problem solving. Communities reinforced these practices. Neighbors exchanged tips, shared tools, and pooled resources when necessary, creating networks of support that eased the strain of limited means. Children absorbed these lessons early, learning that ingenuity and patience could turn scarcity into opportunity, and that the value of a household item often extended far beyond its immediate use. Economic hardship also shaped attitudes toward consumption and celebration. Holidays and birthdays were celebrated with handmade treats, simple decorations, and small luxuries rather than lavish spending. These practices instilled a sense of appreciation for what was available and nurtured creativity, resilience, and shared responsibility. Looking back, the clever resourcefulness of 1950s Canadians is as inspiring as it is practical. It shows how necessity can foster innovation, how modest means can still produce warmth and joy, and how families and communities adapted to challenges with intelligence, patience, and care. In many ways, these lessons remain relevant today, a reminder that resourcefulness is not just survival. It is a quiet form of ingenuity and pride. Immigrant kitchens and cultural blends. The 1950s in Canada were a period of rebuilding and growth, shaped in large part by waves of immigrants bringing their traditions, flavors, and culinary wisdom from around the world. Kitchens became spaces of cultural convergence, where recipes carried the echoes of distant homelands and adapted to the ingredients and realities of Canadian life. Families preserved the tastes of Europe, Asia, and beyond, blending them with local staples to create meals that were both familiar and newly inventive. Immigrant kitchens were laboratories of adaptation. Sauerkraut, pierogies, and cabbage rolls found their way onto Canadian tables alongside potatoes and roasts. Spices and herbs from distant lands mingled with locally grown vegetables. And humble ingredients were elevated through techniques passed down through generations. Mothers and grandmothers became both preservers of tradition and creative problem solvers, teaching children how to honor heritage while making the most of what was available at nearby markets. Meals in these homes were more than sustenance. They were storytelling, history, and memory on a plate. Every dish carried a narrative of migration, resilience, and adaptation. Cooking became a way to retain identity while embracing a new country, allowing families to maintain connections to their roots while participating in Canadian life. Recipes were shared with neighbors, adapted for local tastes, and eventually influenced broader culinary culture, helping to diversify what Canadians considered home cooking. Looking back, immigrant kitchens of the 1950s were pivotal in shaping Canada's food landscape. They exemplified creativity, resilience, and the blending of cultures through flavor. Beyond taste, they were spaces of learning, family connection, and cultural continuity, reminding us that food is both nourishment and narrative, capable of bridging worlds and preserving heritage while fostering new traditions. From slow cooking to fast food, a cultural shift. In 1950s Canada, the pace of life was beginning to change, and nowhere was this more evident than in the kitchen. Home cooking still reigned supreme. Soup simmered for hours. Roasts filled homes with rich, savory aromas, and desserts were patiently baked from scratch. These meals were acts of care, reflecting both frugality and a love of craft. Preparing dinner was an event, a daily rhythm that connected families and honored tradition. Yet, even in this era, the seeds of a cultural shift were appearing. Fast food restaurants and ready-made conveniences began to creep into neighborhoods, offering quick meals for families balancing work, school, and social life. Hamburgers, fries, and canned soups promise speed, uniformity, and ease, a stark contrast to the slow, hands-on preparations of traditional home cooking. While these innovations were convenient, they signaled a broader shift in Canadian food culture, hinting at the coming decades when efficiency and accessibility would often outweigh tradition. The juxtaposition of slow-cooked meals and emerging fast foods highlighted both societal change and domestic ingenuity. Homemakers learned to negotiate this balance, incorporating canned ingredients, quick prep foods, or partially prepared items into meals while still striving for homemade flavor and presentation. Children and teenagers, increasingly exposed to marketing and new dining habits, began to influence family choices, planting the seeds of the fast food culture that would dominate later decades. Looking back, this period captures a fascinating moment of transition. Slow cooking represented patience, skill, and connection to tradition, while fast food introduced convenience, speed, and novelty. Together, they tell the story of a culture negotiating modernity and heritage, revealing how Canadian kitchens evolved in response to shifting lifestyles, technological innovation, and changing tastes. In this era, the smells of a simmering pot and the allure of a quick meal existed side by side, each marking a different facet of Canadian life and culinary identity. Lessons in frugality, community, and resilience. The 1950s in Canada were a time when resourcefulness wasn't just admired, it was necessary. Families learned to make every dollar count, stretching ingredients, repurposing leftovers, and finding inventive solutions to daily challenges. Frugality wasn't about deprivation. It was a practical approach to life that fostered creativity, skill, and pride. From turning stale bread into breadcrumbs to reimagining yesterday's vegetables in hearty soups. Every household had its own repertoire of clever solutions, honed through experience and necessity. Community played a central role in this era of shared ingenuity. Neighbors exchanged advice, recipes, and resources, creating informal networks of support that strengthened social bonds. A surplus of vegetables might be traded for eggs, a jar of preserves shared during a visit, or a piece of fabric lent to a neighbor for a sewing project. These interactions nurtured trust, collaboration, and a sense of belonging, making daily life not just manageable but meaningful. Children absorb these lessons naturally, learning that cooperation, thoughtfulness, and empathy were as vital as any practical skill. Resilience defined both families and individuals. Households navigated economic pressures, shortages, and the demands of domestic labor with determination and ingenuity. Challenges were met with problem solving and patience, whether in the kitchen, the laundry room, or the garden. In doing so, Canadians of the 1950s built a foundation of self-reliance that shaped attitudes toward work, family, and community for generations to come. Looking back, these lessons are timeless. Frugality, community, and resilience weren't just strategies for survival. They were values that enriched daily life, strengthened family bonds, and fostered a culture of care and creativity. In 1950s Canada, the everyday act of making do with what was available became a quiet celebration of ingenuity, connection, and the enduring human spirit. Nostalgia on the modern table, remembering the 1950s. Today, when we open our cupboards or scroll through TikTok recipe videos, it's easy to forget the rhythms and resourcefulness of 1950s Canadian kitchens. Meals were slower, more deliberate, and deeply connected to family, community, and the seasons. From simmering stews to braided Easter breads, every dish carried intention, care, and a touch of creativity born from necessity. The modern table, with its convenience foods and meal kits, offers speed and uniformity. But it often lacks the warmth, ritual, and hands-on connection that defined mid-century home cooking. Remembering the 1950s is more than culinary nostalgia. It's a reflection on values and lifestyles. Families gathered around tables without smartphones, sharing stories, laughter, and lessons while savoring dishes made from scratch. Community was tangible. Neighbors swapped recipes, exchanged ingredients, and supported one another through daily challenges. Even chores, laundry, and sewing became opportunities for skill building, ingenuity, and quiet bonding. Food was both sustenance and a medium for memory, identity, and connection. The contrast to today is striking. Modern convenience has its perks, yet there is something enduring in the creativity, resourcefulness, and care of 1950s cooking. Each dish tells a story of resilience, frugality, and love. A reminder that the simplest ingredients, handled thoughtfully, can nourish not just the body but the heart. By revisiting these practices and flavors, we honor the past while enriching the present, finding inspiration in kitchens that were both humble and extraordinary. On the modern table, nostalgia for the 1950s lives in the aromas of homemade bread, the sweetness of hand-baked cookies, and the comforting richness of stews and casseroles. It invites us to slow down, savor, and connect. To remember that meals are about more than eating. They are about sharing, creating, and carrying forward the timeless lessons of care, family, and resilience. And that's a glimpse into 1950s Canada. From bustling grocery aisles to backyard games, from homemade stews to front porch stories, life in 1950s Canada was a mix of hard work, creativity, and community spirit. We hope this trip back in time sparked some nostalgia and maybe even inspired you to try a recipe or revive a family tradition. If you enjoyed this journey through mid-century Canadian life, don't forget to like and share the video. Subscribe for more stories, recipes, and memories from the past. And tell us in the comments, which 1950s moment would you love to experience for yourself?